This session is about ethnography and research methodology, pretty popular in the social sciences, originated from anthropology. And we talked about using visual data and audio data, and all these technologies have a great potential to observe children's behaviors. But as we agreed during the whole day, different in the different sessions, okay, it would be much better if we all this data collection is complemented with human intervention.
Yeah. I work at Northern Illinois University. Yang brought me onto this project because I am a methodologist, so I get to work with lots of different kinds of projects. My main research area is very similar to Vincey's in looking at youth identity development related to activism and community engagement, and I do a lot of ethnographic work in Chicago. I have a lot of experience in doing in-depth sorts of observations in many settings. I have done lots of classroom observations as well as in community settings. Robots for young children is very new to me, so I've learned so much today, and I've taken all these furious notes. Probably if I had come to these presentations and then put this together, there would be some other things in here, but it's been great because Yang, when she asked me to speak, she said, think of this as all, the 2 days is going to be a conversation, and so I think there's a lot of threads that I'm going to try to speak to that were brought up in other presentations, but how this can just be a starting point. When in putting this together, I just thought of ideas. What would be helpful in thinking and using ethnography and ethnographic observations to better understand how the social ecologies of classrooms, right, and of peer cultures, and also children's language and language interactions, and how the robots can better facilitate these sorts of interactions. So as has been pointed out, so here at Northern I work in the educational technology research and assessment, so we have a bunch of people who work in instructional technology, but I teach the research methods classes. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and also I think this is really great to end with this because it kind of addresses all the messiness of the context that I was nodding my head a lot thinking, there's the gaps in trying to figure out how messy these context is, the challenges of dealing with variation and diversity and naturalistic settings, and ethnography does a lot of that. That's kind of what it's meant to do. So I know some of you might be more familiar with ethnography than others, and so I want to provide some background, but I'm not going to provide a history of ethnography or cultural anthropology, but really ethnographic field work, and also it's called participant observation, is very immersive. It occurs in naturalistic contexts, so it's very well suited to being able to go into classrooms and observe children. It's also very flexible, which I think is very appropriate for this project because we want the information that we're getting from these observations to inform, right, the design, right, maybe of the robot and the tool and the instructional strategies, and iterative and recursive in going back and forth. So we'll start maybe in a broader sorts of observations and then have them become more refined and focused along the way and let some of what we're learning inform what we decide to focus our observations on. And then ethnographic fieldwork is very descriptive. There's this whole idea of thick description that Clifford Gertz, who wrote some seminal pieces in ethnography and cultural anthropology, and he has this whole idea of, and this is where sometimes the visual data doesn't give you the whole story, right, or even the audio data, that he has this example of the difference between a wink and a blink, right, and so they both look the same, right, but the intention is very different often. The causes of them are very different. The purpose and the implications, and then also the consequences for not reading them correctly. And I was thinking, I think a lot of our younger folks here left, so I was saying they might not get this reference, but there's that whole Seinfeld episode of where George Costanza keeps on blinking and people think he's winking and hilarity ensues and all sorts of miscommunications. But it's important for us to have that thick description, background, history on the context. And then also all the insider meanings. So I think this is really important. Within one setting, there's all sorts of multiple meanings. So we're not, the settings we're going into are not monolithic in any sort of way. So we need to pay attention to that. Now, ethnographic fieldwork is largely inductive, meaning that you don't go in with a hypothesis beforehand that you want to test, but you would develop certain theoretical or conceptual orientations beforehand, and the inductive and deductive would be in constant conversation. And because some of the work that we're going to be doing really has a foundation in some existing work, I'm sure that there are going to be deductive processes as well. We're interested in looking at social ecologies, local meetings, contextual circumstances, and in ethnographic work really is filtered through researchers' perceptions, experiences, and commitments, so that we all bring our own lenses to the work. And I think that's important because the people working on these sorts of projects have particular lenses that I think can inform the way we look at interactions in particular ways. And sometimes, and I just started because I've been sick, I canceled my first class, so my first class for my qualitative research class was this week, and someone was asking, well, what about the reactive effects? Aren't you going to change what people are doing when you're in there and observing, and you don't get to be behind the glass so they know you're there? And so some people would say that ethnographers being there cause contamination, or contaminate the setting, but they can also be a source of learning, and I see this as, and you mentioned that you being able to, so you're maybe making a mistake with the robot right there actually led to some conversations, and for you to be able to have increased understanding about certain kinds of practices or routines or scripts or forms of interaction. So we always think that the kind of relationships between the researcher and people, in the study really can provide some insight into kind of social rules for behavior and sorts of interactions. Now, levels of participation, and this is something that sometimes people think, well, participant observation always means you're highly involved, but there is really a continuum along which an ethnographic observation would happen. One would be no participation, where you might be watching and observing a television program and doing an ethnography of that. Passive, where you might have no membership role, could be behind a glass, or you're an observer at a public place. And then moderate, which is what I see probably in this project we would be doing, where there's peripheral membership. You would maintain some balance between insider, outsider, become involved in some activities. Now some ethnographers take really active roles in what they're doing and seek to do what others are doing and learn the cultural rules. That might not be so appropriate for us because we can't, all of a sudden we're going to become children in here, but it's really how you can learn behaviors and become involved. It's not always possible. And then complete, some ethnographers do work in settings where they're already a participant, and this is often called autoethnography, in order to get better understanding of their own role and practices and setting. Now, some types of field notes that are often taken, and this is really some of this is logistical stuff, but I think it's important to think about before you do the study, is kind of what sorts of recordings are you going to do? Are there going to be videotapes of the observations? But often you start where you just write jotted notes in the field, and Spradley refers to these as condensed accounts. And then you type these up into more formalized field notes. So I think sometimes people think, oh, people go into the field and they just, oh, this is interesting, they write it down. But it can take easily, you go into the field for 1 hour and take notes. It takes 5 hours then for you to go home and type all of them up into these formalized field notes, because you're filling in what's called head notes, the things you remember, right? That from the setting to get all those visual details. Things that you might not have remembered to jot down. And this is really important. Annette Leroux, who's done a lot of ethnographies in classrooms, has this 24-hour rule that I always share with my students, which means if you don't write it down within 24 hours, you don't use it, right? So otherwise it's too hard for things to blend together. And if we're really looking at certain kind of trajectories and developments, if everything blends together, we might miss that between one observation and the next, there might have been some development or some sort of interaction with between students that was very unique, and we think, well, did that happen this time or that other time? So it's really important to kind of keep to a system of writing things down. And you might use audio or video to support your jottings, but that doesn't mean that you would only rely on that. For some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, that you can't just rely on visual and audio. Now, there's also types of observations that Spradley, who he's written a bunch of foundational work on participant observation, also ethnographic interviews, identifies. And the early ones start with descriptive, and you're just, what's going on here? So you're asking descriptive questions. It aligns with what's called domain analysis that I'm going to talk about better, where you're trying to look at kind of what are some kind of, how is this place organized? How are activities organized? And then as you progress in the observations, they would become more focused and the scope would be narrow, where you might look at particular cultural domains and ask sorts of structural questions, looking at kind of, okay, within these certain domains, how are these organized? There could be smaller units in that. What are the characteristics of them? And then you would go to selected, which would be even more narrow, and you would look for differences among particular categories, might ask contrast questions, and look at the components of particular parts of domains. And I'm going to show you some examples of ways that ethnographers might do analysis that I think could be useful to what we're talking about here. Now, the kind of language in field notes would be, you would use verbatim language whenever possible, so you avoid summaries. Use insider terms, so we will want to use the children's language, as well as our own, distinguish between our observers' terms that we would use or the observer uses to describe certain things. Very concrete language again, rather than just generalized language and summaries. Provide details that contextualize talk as much as possible. So that would mean that in going into, if we were observing children, we wouldn't just be describing the interaction between the children, but what was going on around while they might be interacting. If this was happening in a classroom, if it's happening in a tutoring session, what does the environment look like? What are some of the other details that we need to know in order to contextualize their interactions? And also pay attention to co-occurrences, and this is, I was thinking about this a lot, kind of intersections of certain topics and types of dialogue could be interesting. What does that tell us about what sorts of maybe activities facilitate dialogue more than others or facilitate interactions? Are there certain topics that tend to generate more interactions amongst children than others? Certain sorts of relationships among children. I'm going to talk a little bit about power too within the classroom in a bit. And in a descriptive, this is one of the hardest things I think to do, is that when you're really excited about something and you're writing your notes, you want to start to analyze things right away, right? And so in your descriptive field notes, it's important to avoid any of those judgments, evaluations, reflections, and interpretations early on, so that you can just focus on the descriptive. And if there's something that you want to provide some commentary analysis right away, that's separated from anything descriptive. There's just some ways, and I'm still thinking through all these things of how they could relate to the observations that we're going to do, but there's some kind of matrices to help organize observations and to help ethnographers think through all the different spaces and actors and events and objects that can give insight into behaviors and practices. So this is one from Spradley, where you start with a grand tour to look at, in a classroom, so I'll just talk about a classroom, the spaces, the people involved, acts that people do, objects that are present, different events within a classroom, the time, goals, and feelings. And there's this big matrix that I know it's hard to see, but it has all of those. It has all of these characteristics on the top, and then on the side as a way of thinking, then how can we look at the intersections between these spaces, places, and sequences of events. And so it could be a nice organizing tool for initial visits to the classroom to say, what are we going to pay attention to? And obviously these might not all apply to the sorts of observations that we're doing, but I think it's good to think through what sorts of things we might be interested in. These are kind of an overview, a summary of the types of info that would be in descriptive field notes. Portraits of participants, reconstructions of dialogue, descriptions of setting, accounts of particular events, depictions of activities, and our own behavior, and that we would do grand tour versus mini tour. And then I have some things on how you might do reflections and analysis within notes, but then as time goes on, usually ethnographers start to then write some separate reflective field notes, some in-process memos to do the analysis. So you think about analysis, you think about problems, challenges, some of the things we were talking about maybe maybe there's a child isn't able to be understood by the robot, and what is the response to that? So that would be something that you might reflect on. Any ethical dilemmas and conflicts that can often come up when you're doing ethnographic field work. Observer's frame of mind and points of clarification. So this would accompany, and it can give insight a lot to the descriptive field notes, to have these reflective field notes. Now, some of the ways that ethnographers analyze ethnographic data, and it's very open. We use open coding, which means, again, usually we don't identify codes beforehand. We allow those to emerge from the actual data corpus, and very inductive. There's many cycles, we don't just code and then, oh, we have everything, everything's neat and tidy, right? So then usually we use some second cycle, and I just started putting together some second cycle strategies that I thought might be useful for the data that we'll be looking at. And a very basic one is pattern coding, where you look at things that you've coded similarly and see, are there patterns here? You look at codes together and see, are there intersections between these two different pieces of coded data that could be useful? Axial coding, which would be used to identify and describe processes. It comes from grounded theory, but we borrow a lot within interpretive research from different sorts of analysis strategies, and so that could be useful. And then, as I mentioned before, domain analysis, where we really try to identify and describe domains of knowledge, which I think could be useful in looking at children's peer cultures and knowledge that they bring to these interactions with the robot. I think this is a point that I really wanted to make also, is that in interpretive research and ethnography, we're really interested in discrepant cases and deviant voices, what some people might call outliers. We would say, no, that's part of the story, right? That we want to look at those differing points of view and multiple perspectives, and often it's not just about seeing, oh, is everyone doing the same thing and all the arrows going in the same direction, but what, again, like these are complex and messy spaces, and what is that complexity about what's going on between the children and in these spaces tell us about their practices in using this technology. So I have some examples that I'm going to go through quickly from my own work, but just looking at this as an example of pattern coding, axial coding, as I said, from grounded theory models, usually uses a first cycle code as an axis, and then tries to look at, well, what are the characteristics, attributes, properties, and dimensions of that code, what are the conditions, and then what might be some of the consequences, and that's why it's useful for looking at certain processes, including learning processes. I did my dissertation on young mothers, young Latino mothers who had left school before graduating and were attending a literacy program to get their diploma, and this was one of the axial codes I developed for the process of dropping out of school. Now, domain analysis, again, you look at kind of large units of cultural knowledge and then see if you can find what they're composed of, the cover term and included terms, and then really look at kind of semantic relationships within a particular domain. And so this was one that I developed for, again, in my dissertation many years ago now, for looking at how young parents develop parenting skills in situ, and one was learning by doing, learning from mistakes, learning from observation, and then under each one of those I had a lot more details, but it just gives you a sense of how you can use it to kind of organize behaviors, practices, and domains of knowledge. Now here are some things that I thought about more specifically related to this particular project, but things to think about, power within the classroom as we're looking at interactions with robots. And so I came up with between children, between adults and children, and between adults. But then I thought, oh, especially after the bullying example with the robot, where they were hitting the robot, I said, there might be some power relationships between the robot and the children as well, between the robot and teachers, right? So I think that bringing the technology, and the technology is its own actor, right, in the setting, and so what sorts of power relationships might arise that we need to look at. And the importance of looking and listening to children, and I think that's really been brought to the fore, that we don't have enough data and evidence about children's language and interaction, and that to put into the technology, but that being able in these ethnographic observations, being able to pay attention to peer cultures, and especially the complex sociocultural context within the classroom, inequality in the classroom with language too. So I think that's really important when we're going to be looking at dual language classrooms, and my daughter goes to actually a dual language school, and that's an issue all the time of getting students to speak Spanish in the classroom because they said, well, I want to speak English. That's the dominant language, and so I think that those larger contexts, or the interactions that the children are having around this technology are certainly impacted and by that larger context, right? And so also positionality of the researcher, I think, is important. If researchers and observers going in there are to really conduct these observations in authentic ways, they need to build relationships with the children. And there's also some really great work by Barry Thorne, where she looked at she looked at gender on the playground in the classroom and the kinds of questions that she was asked about who she was, what kind of adult was she, and then Ann Dyson, who she does a lot of language literacy work and narrative development, but how she was interested in kids' social worlds and unofficial worlds, and so she wanted them to talk about what they normally talked about in front of her. So she had to find a way to be a certain kind of an adult in the classroom. So we need to think as researchers, who are we? What kind of adult are we? How do we explain that to children? And how do we build relationships with the children? And then also thinking about within the technology, how is it integrating culturally responsive pedagogy and funds of knowledge, and what are those in the classroom, and how can we use those to maybe build on those to make the technology more authentic. And then this whole idea of interpretive reproduction by Corsaro, that children they're agents, and this was mentioned before. They're agents, and they're creating their own peer culture. They participate in society and appropriate, information from the adult world, but they're creating their own unique peer culture and concerns, and we need to pay attention to that. And then just maybe thinking about ways we can use ethnography of communication as a way of organizing some of these. And I have some stuff here. I'm not a sociolinguist, but I'm interested in how methodologically it might be used to help organize our observations into thinking about speech situations, speech events, and speech acts within these interactions amongst the children and with the robots. And this is Heim's speaking grid that might also help us think through some of these observations. So again, these are just some notes thinking about how ethnographic observations and field work might help us really add some complexity to some, and also fill in the gaps that I think a lot of people really mention. Here's some references that I can send. People going in are going to have particular lenses, right? And it doesn't mean that there's one right way to view a situation. I think if we bring a bunch of researchers in and we have different insights to share, and that's kind of what I meant about the different lenses. We're coming from different perspectives, and that doesn't mean that we all have to come in and see things in exactly the same way, but that our disciplines, I think, can provide us insight about meaning making. And for me, it's more about, if you are going to make a claim, an assertion, is it well substantiated? Is it plausible? Could someone else read it and say, oh yes, this doesn't seem like they're making stuff up, and they have examples and a good data set. So that's kind of where my idea of reliability lies, is being rigorous as a researcher, making sure you have a substantial amount of data and are very explicit about your methods, but not necessarily that we all need to come up with one answer, because even within that setting, there's going to be all sorts of multiple perspectives, and it's just our job to kind of substantiate that with data from our study.